Welcome back to another episode of the Dandelion podcast, where we talk to the best facilitators, organizers, and hosts using the Dandelion platform at dandelion.events. My name is Stephen Reed, and in this episode, I speak to Conor Cregg. Conor is a coach, counselor, and group process facilitator who runs retreats and workshops for men via the Psychedelic Society's Soulful Masculinity activity and on sexuality via the organization Sex Club. Conor discusses his background in psychology, his journey towards the embodied and spiritual, and what goes on at his retreats. He emphasizes the importance of presence, vulnerability, and creating safe yet brave spaces for people to share openly and honestly about their experiences. It's clear that Conor's work extends far beyond the realm of traditional coaching or therapy. By creating immersive, experiential spaces that encourage real authenticity, he helps participants break down barriers, challenge societal norms, and embrace their true selves. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Conor Cregg. So it is my pleasure to be joined today by Conor Cregg. How are you doing, Conor?
I'm good. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Where are you speaking from today?
A little cottage in Totnes in Devon. I'm right next to a church that bell rings every 15 minutes. So let's hope Zoom's noise cancelling software cuts that out.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a chance for you to introduce yourself and say a
Mhm.
little bit about what you do, and then we'll get stuck into some juicy questions.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I guess my work is in two parts. One is working with people one to one. It's kind of in the world of coaching, counseling, therapy. I'm not a qualified psychotherapist, done some training as a counselor. It's kind of in that world. So I work with lots of people over Zoom doing that. And then I also run a number of different groups. So one of the main ones, I've been working in men's work for about 10 years now, running various groups around masculinity, men's work, the types of issues that men run into. Some of them are unique to men, and some are, more general, just kind of human stuff. And then I also run an organization called Sex Club with my business partner, Jules Muller, who's currently on maternity leave, taking care of a brand new baby. And we've been doing that together for about 7 years now. And that's really just creating a space for people to talk about intimacy, sexuality, sex, relationships, all things related to them, which when you start to dig in is so much. And then I'm also involved in Path of Love, which is kind of, good to give them recognition right at the beginning because so much of the work that I do has been influenced by my experience with them doing the Path of Love 7-day retreat 9 years ago and then working with them, apprenticing under them, mentoring with them ever since. So
So how
yeah.
would you describe Path of Love exactly? It's a kind of group psychotherapy retreat? Or...
Yeah, I've heard different people describe it in lots of different ways, always like super effusively. It's an incredible 7-day residential group therapy process, which kind of doesn't do it justice because it kind of enters at the level of psychology and psychotherapy and transcends it and heads into the realms of spiritual and transformational. And it changed my life and it changed the life of lots of people I know. And it's given me a language to talk about this work and a set of skills for doing this work. So yeah, I really owe a lot to that organization and particularly to Rafia Morgan, one of the founders, who's a close friend and has taught me a lot as well.
Let's just keep riffing on that for a
Yeah.
second then. So you said it's more than therapy in a way,
Yeah.
and I believe it has at least some of its roots in Osho and also the diamond approach, if I'm not wrong. So it has this spiritual underpinning. So would you say you're working with the spiritual or the shamanic of some of these words that maybe kind of point beyond the purely therapeutic in what you do?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, people refer to it, and I think of it, I guess, very similarly to how people speak about, say, an ayahuasca ceremony, where they say, it was like doing 50 or 100 hours of therapy in one night. The Path of Love feels a little bit like that as well. It's like doing years of therapy in 7 days. And yeah, it's influence. So some of the founders were involved with Osho, and obviously that's a complicated history. And it's been really interesting to like dive into that with them and have dinner and have a drink and really go, what was that like? And what was it like when the wheels started to come off? And how do you then think about the work of someone who had a lot to offer? And not just that Osho had a lot to offer, which I think he did, though, obviously in lots of controversial ways, but also that he became like a beacon at that time in the 60s and
Mm.
70s when people were coming from all over the world, and it influenced a lot of the work that then went on from there. People would come and experience stuff and then leave and take it away. So it's kind of had this really big ripple effect. And yeah, as I say, I'd say that the work definitely starts at the level of that you have to meet the person where they are. And sometimes that's very much in the mind and in the story and in the psychology of it all. And then you go through that into the therapeutics and like, okay, how about we start to explore that more? In my work and in the Path of Love work, there's a lot of exposure and catharsis. So exposing what it is that we're struggling with, and then having time and space to really feel it in the body, stop it from just being a story in the head. We are embodied beings, like let the body experience the emotion of the thing. And in that way, then we're actually working with something here now. Whenever I work with people in groups or one to one, it's like we're not just here to retell the story, because in a lot of ways, you end up just reinforcing the story that way. We tell the story, we start to find the roots of it, and then we start to feel what was going on at that time when the story really got its roots in, and what wasn't allowed to be felt or what wasn't supported in being felt. And then as we do that, we start to free ourselves, disentangle ourselves from some of the stories and conditioning. And then all sorts of things start to feel possible. There's this a feeling of freedom. There's a feeling of, yes, being human, being more human, more myself than before. But it's, from my perspective, at least, it's through that becoming more and more human and more myself that the possibility of transcending myself becomes possible. It's through, not around the human.
Mm.
And Path of Love really works that way. And I really learned to work that way.
Nice. So I certainly heard something about the importance of the somatic and the embodied there in yeah, moving through what might be difficult content and past challenges, not purely intellectualizing it. That said, you do have a pretty strong academic background yourself, don't you? You have degrees, I believe, in psychology and then a master's in behavior change. So is that something that you also bring into your work?
Yeah, that's my background. Yeah, there are things I definitely weave in. And, you know, I don't mean at all to pathologize the mind. And, it's an incredible tool and part of who we are. It's that so often it's out of balance. So often our society teaches us, conditions us to focus on the abstract, on the intellectual, particularly in the case of men, but definitely for men and women. There's this reliance on abstraction from our experience, more analysis than experience. And that can be really, really limiting. And it can actually push us further and further into the thing that we're trying to move away from. And so it's about, okay, how can I include my mind so that I understand some of the story, some of the why, but then use my body, my emotional body, to experience the thing. So not just talk about, I had a really difficult relationship with my dad, and that was because he had with his dad. It's not actually true for me. I have a very lucky to have a really great relationship with my dad, but as an example. And so someone might say that and have that kind of understanding, but unless we slow down and go, hold on a minute, that must have been really tough to have a difficult relationship with your dad. And then the person gets a moment to pause and go, yeah, you know what, actually, that's true. And then
Mm,
actually feel it. And then
mm,
something's actually happening right here and now. And the
mm,
body will be responding to that. It's like, okay, so where is it in the body? How do we feel that? How do we give that some space? And then something that wasn't allowed to complete at the time, because, as a child, having a difficult relationship with a parent is kind of seems or feels unacceptable. But now, as an adult, we create a space where actually I can allow myself to feel that that was really hard and feel the pain of that and allow that thing that wasn't allowed to complete at the time to complete now.
yeah.
Some healing starts to happen.
So the sense that I'm getting is that perhaps quite often people are having quite intensely releasing experiences through your work, which we'll get into
Mhm.
in detail shortly. But in the context of working in this way that can actually bring up quite intense experiences for people, what are some of the things that you have to keep in mind as a professional to ensure that people are feeling safe, that the space is being held in an ethical way?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think increasingly people are becoming aware that we need to be trauma informed, and that really is the case. Prior to people like Peter Levine's work, People were actually being re-traumatized. And through the work of some really great people, we've come to the understanding that actually we need to be more aware of trauma and how it works, and yes, allow people to revisit the things that were difficult and traumatizing potentially, but in a way that is controlled and within what the body and the system is able to hold. So a model I like to use, I picked it up from a guy called Alistair Creamer, who I worked with about a decade ago on a kind of coaching course we ran together. He he had this model at the time that I've since used a lot, which is like a comfort, stretch, panic zone. In the center, in the comfort zone, is where we go to rest and digest, and it's really important for integration, and we need to spend time there. But in order to grow, we have to step outside of that comfort zone, and what exists outside the comfort zone is the stretch zone, and that's where the learning happens, and it is stretching, much like physical stretching. It's not totally comfortable. It does have a little bit of activation and arousal and challenge to it. And then at the edges of the stretch zone, we reach into the panic zone. And in the panic zone, that's actually when we come out of the capacity to really learn and grow, because the body enters into the sympathetic nervous system and into the fight flight response. So whenever I run any groups, I always introduce that model really early on, right at the beginning, to give people a map of how to think about these experiences that might come up. And also, explaining to them what disassociation looks like. What does it look like when something is overwhelming and we start to disconnect, to notice that? What does it look like when we enter into that panic zone and we start to get overactivated? What does that look like? How do we do it? So we start by informing people using our awareness of trauma and how people respond to challenging, vulnerable issues, and we share it with them. So that we try to have an education piece, and then everything we offer is always as an invitation. It's like, this is the journey, these are the prompts, these are the inquiries that we're putting forward, but it's an invitation, and we really want you to like check in with yourself about what's the right amount for you now.
Nice.
And actually, that's a much deeper learning than anything you're going to learn by pushing through, is that awareness of learning how to stop and check. I'm like, okay, let me just pause for a minute and check whether this feels like, yeah, this feels good. This feels like, yeah, it's stretching, it's tricky, but I've got it. Or am I actually numbing out to something inside that's telling me this is a bit too much? And that process of learning, that introspection, hugely important, and is at the center of all of the work I do, educating people to really build that muscle.
Thank you. I was struck by what a range of different people you cite in terms of influences and people that have inspired you in various ways, been teachers to you, from Carl Jung to Brené Brown and Hansi Freinacht, many others. So maybe you could mention just one or two thinkers that are really with you right now, that like have more recently been feeding into your practice.
Yeah. Well, the two you gave were actually really good examples and really live, always live for me. I feel like the person I most often reference is probably Brene Brown, because she just nailed something that needed to be verbalized. She really put it into words so perfectly. I mean, anyone listening who hasn't heard her work before, she's got some great books out there, but probably her TED Talk is the quickest and easiest and most accessible way to get a sense of her work. And really, what she was saying, at the core of what she was saying, was about vulnerability and how challenging it can be for us to express the things that make us feel vulnerable, and that vulnerability by its very nature is difficult. And if it's not difficult, then it's probably not vulnerability. And how that interacts with things like shame and how to work with shame. And one of her quotes that I use all the time is that shame doesn't withstand exposure. And I would kind of augment that to say shame doesn't withstand exposure in a supportive environment. What that means is that, shame is this belief within us that if you were to know this thing about me, I would no longer be lovable or acceptable to you. And that belief is something that all of us hold in one way or another about something in our lives. It's in there, that belief that if I was to really reveal this stuff, then people's image of me would change, and for the worse. And often it's just not the case. Actually, if we were to really have the courage to step into the vulnerability and expose that thing, that people understand that we're flawed, we're human. It actually brings us closer to one another to understand and see one another's flaws. So her work is like really, really significant and important to really guide a lot of what I do.
Mm.
Then the other person you mentioned is another really great example, Jung. I mean, Jung is a tricky one to read directly. A lot of his work is kind of spread out in lots of different places, and I actually recommend that if people want to get into the work of Carl Jung, to find a really good like summary or compendium of his work, because a lot of it's scattered in lots of places. But the man was a genius, you know, the number of insights he had and a number of different places was incredible. And ultimately, a lot of the work that we're doing is about bringing the unconscious into the conscious, bringing it into awareness. You know, awareness is the first step. We have to be aware of the thing to be able to work with the thing. So when we bring it from behind where it's operating into the shadows and right out in front of us, so we're aware of it, then we have the possibility of a choice, possibility of a choice to change that thing. So he's super influential in lots of ways. And it's funny because when I studied psychology academically, my first ever psychology lecture, the first thing I was told was that Freud was a quack, and they didn't even mention Jung. He wasn't even in the course material.
Mm.
So that was part of what kind of drifted me away from psychology thereafter. I was a bit disappointed by it. It was like a self-conscious science. It wanted to be a science, even though it was dealing with a lot of material that was hard to put through the scientific method. So yeah, I ended up moving away from psychology or through psychology maybe into more psychotherapy, spirituality. Yeah, more those places where the mystery is dealt with in ways where it doesn't have to be operationalized to be able to form it into an experiment.
Mm. Well, nowadays you're doing a lot of work with men. So maybe let's turn to that, and maybe you can tell us a bit about what drew you to working with men specifically. Maybe there was some particular moment or event that made
Mm.
you think, yeah, this is the direction I need to head in.
Yeah, so I did the psychology and then I was a little bit disappointed because I really thought that maybe there would be some answers here. And thereafter I kind of went exploring. I traveled a lot, did some plant medicines, really tried to expand my horizons. And then I was really fascinated by the environmental movement and sustainability and development in the third world. And I was like, okay, these areas that are really trying to work on improving the world directly. And I did some exploring there and again found that actually so many of these things seem to be symptoms of a wider kind of what's called now the metacrisis, I guess, that there is a crisis of belonging, a sense of meaning, a sense of connection with other people, a sense of welcome on the earth. You know, I often say, and I feel it's really true, that at the core of what so many people are seeking is to feel seen, heard, understood, and accepted. And people not feeling those things creates a certain type of spiritual angst that then we try and fill with buying things or achieving things. And so once I kind of came to that realization, I thought, okay, well, what's the intervention point? How do I take that insight and start to be part of addressing that issue? And there's lots of different ways, but I really felt there was a lack of intervention or support with men. You know, women have obviously very explicitly for a very long time suffered under the patriarchy, and that really can't be recognized and verbalized enough. And, you know, a lot of work still needs to be done to continue that process that we're on. But men too have suffered under the patriarchy, you know. The box for men to exist in is very, very small. You know, traditionally it's strong and silent, and that kind of modernist view. And then the postmodern view is the critique of that and started to go into the kind of almost throwing the baby out with the bathwater at times, some of the more traditional masculine qualities or characteristics, and we became really focused on the critique of the masculine. And actually, where I'm at is a kind of meta modern, the kind of bringing together of both. How do we take the critique, which is valid, and the traditional understanding, which had its merits, and create something that transcends, includes, and transcends those things? And so that's the way I try to work with men, and the why I try and work with men is that it feels like a really significant intervention point to try and
Mm,
address this crisis that's going on for all of us.
nice. And I believe you've been running two different retreats
Yeah.
through the Dandelion platform and the Psychedelic Society over the past, well, few years now. One of which is the call, the other of which is
So it's the masculine archetypes, the warrior, magician, lover, king.
yeah. Sometimes there is also a meta-modern masculinity course.
Yeah, there's been lots of different versions. I've kind of been experimenting and learning and refining. So there was a meta-modern masculinity course. Yeah, very much about that piece that I was just speaking about. There was a soulful masculinity course, lots of different things, but the
Yeah.
call and the archetypes, one of the ones that I'm currently still running.
I read the description for the call, and there's big focus on purpose, meaning,
Mm-hmm.
direction.
Hmm.
And it goes on to talk about men refusing the call to
Hmm.
find meaning and purpose in their lives. So
Hmm.
first I thought I'd ask, like, how does that show up in someone's life, in a man's life, when they
Yeah.
refuse the call? What do you
Yeah.
often see there?
Yeah, I really loved this. So it comes from the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell's work. And actually, this idea of refusing the call, it's like the second step of, depending on the level of detail the model you look at, 13 or more. And it kind of came up. I've been in this online men's group for 3 or 4 years now. Throughout the pandemic, we were together, and at one point, someone was referencing this refusal of the call, and it really struck me. I started going into it and reading up on it. It felt like a really significant moment. And the idea is that, we're all on adventures all of the time. The micro to the macro of our entire life's adventure, the micro of, going to the shop and coming back successfully with the milk or whatever. So yeah, we're on these adventures all of the time, and the starting point of all of these adventures is the call. Is the invitation into the adventure, is you go to the shops to get the milk, and the person at the cash register says maybe more than just hi. That's the call, that's an invitation. Do I take that kind of olive branch of conversation to strike up an interaction, a connection, or do I kind of give them the bare minimum, yeah, smile, haha, whatever, give the money, walk out and refuse it? And we're all constantly and being given these invitations. And so often what we do is we refuse them. We say, no, not now, not ready, it's inconvenient, I don't want to for whatever reason. And yeah, on the micro, small scale, maybe it's not so significant, but we get into the kind of medium and bigger scale of our lives, and these things start to become really significant. And actually, I really believe that there's a connection with some of the mental health crises that are going on, that if we are repeatedly refusing the call of life, something inside gets depressed, gets kind of shut down. The aliveness gets squashed a little bit.
Mm. So I think what I heard there is it's not so much about like one big call, although it might be. It's
Mhm.
often about a kind of series of everyday calls, even some of which will have more significance than others. So it's almost like a kind of attitude, a posture towards life of saying yes to life and displaying a certain kind of curiosity and willingness to engage. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. On all scales. And for some people, it's easier to answer calls in different areas of life. Some people might be ninjas at work and they have no problem taking every opportunity that presents itself and jumping at it. But maybe in the relationship field, they try to avoid the call to realness ultimately. It's a call to life, it's a call to be real. And I think anyone listening to this, if you were to ask yourself, where in your life are you currently refusing the call?
Mm.
Where in your life is there something that really needs a little bit more of your attention than you're giving it?
Mm.
Maybe there's something in your relationship that's not being addressed. Maybe there's something with the family member that's not being addressed. Maybe you're
Mm.
in a job that isn't fulfilling. Maybe you're not taking care of your physical body and you can feel that, yeah, there's this call. I can feel it. There's this invitation to dust off those, dumbbells you were given for Christmas 10 years ago and start using them again.
And so, what does it feel like? I mean, you described that when you are responding to the call, there's this sense of aliveness, and you made a
Mm,
connection to mental health challenges.
mm,
So maybe one
mhm.
manifestation could be kind of depression or low mood, at least, and so on. But
Mhm.
how else does this refusal of the call like show up in some of the people that you've worked with?
Yeah, well, I think the call itself often kind of provokes a type of low level anxiety
Mm,
because it's I really like Pema Chodron said fear is a natural response to approaching the truth. So
mm,
something about the truth of the call, the aliveness, the like whatever bullshit story I had about myself may or may not be true, may or not be real, and it's in threat when I answer the call and I get into like the real world. So there's a
mm,
certain type of anxiety that comes when we are faced with a call, and so often that anxiety leads us to numb, distract, avoid, not do. I'd say that's
mm,
in today's world, that's probably the most common way that we refuse the call is we
mm,
just subtly, drift from whatever it was we were doing that was connected to this invitation to life and
mm.
open a different tab and go on chess.com or whatever it is that's distracting at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I said, that I think repeatedly, that happening repeatedly, it has a type of dampening effect on our vitality. And so it's really important that we recognize that there are calls there all the time and we challenge ourselves to answer them.
Reminds me a little bit of existential kink. I've forgotten the author's name in this moment, but the kind of the key message that I took from that book was it's impossible to fear something without desiring it, and it's impossible to desire something without fearing it in some way. But there's a very interesting
Mhm.
connection between those two emotions. Okay, well, let's move on to like actually some of what you do in the cool retreat. So you work with rituals, sharing circles, embodiment, myth. So
Mhm.
yeah, how are you helping men to hear the call, say yes to the call through these retreats?
Yeah, well, what I've really discovered over the course of years of doing this work and seeing other more experienced people doing the work and is that the only thing that really has any true healing potential is presence, is my presence with myself and what I'm going through, and the presence that you can offer me in witnessing it, and how that feels for me to be seen, heard, understood, accepted. And so the spaces that I create are always about that, a space for being present with what's really going on for me and being present for what's really going on for the other people there. And for men, that's, wildly different often from how their interactions with men have been in the past. Now, the vast majority of men who come to these retreats, the last time they were in a male-only environment, they were about 16, and it was all about competitively getting ahead. It was all about ripping the piss out of someone or having the piss ripped out of you. And it forms a type of insecurity and people have their backup and the real objective becomes don't do anything that could have me step out or be noticed or get it wrong in any way. So we then again that box of manhood comes in. It's really small and really limiting and we kind of enforce it on one another. So it can be a really profound experience for men to just come and be in a space with other men who are like-minded, who are there to support one another, there to hear one another without giving advice. That's another thing that, men are often conditioned to do. We learn to fix problems. And so when we hear someone else's issues, it's very tempting to want to give advice, as if that person wasn't by far the best placed person to give themselves advice and they already know exactly what they need to do. It's actually what we need is something very different. And often what it is again to just be seen, heard, understood in what it is we're doing, to have it witnessed, to have it be okay that I'm struggling. So a lot of it comes from just that, from men just being together. Each day is always designed around inquiries. So when I say inquiry, I mean an exercise that can be either verbal or embodied as a group, alone, in twos and threes, but the objective is always to get to the edge of what's known. So get through that kind of story that we know so well of ourselves,
Mm.
get to the edge of what's known, and then see if we can take another step into the unknown. How can I expand what I know? How can I bring more of that unconscious material into conscious awareness so that I have the opportunity of changing it? So yeah, that can look like verbal, physical, group, individual, all sorts of things.
Mm.
Catharsis, emotional catharsis is a really big part of it. I always try and include some healthy expression of anger in any of these weekends because it's by far the most maligned emotion. And just like all the other emotions, it's totally valid. And there's lots of moments when it's really important and adds a lot of vitality in life. But there's a
Mm.
big difference, of course, between anger and aggression. And actually, aggression comes from people who don't have a good relationship with their anger.
Mm.
So actually, the answer to that type of aggression out there in society is people becoming more familiar and more comfortable and more skilled with working with their anger.
Mm. So am I understanding then that it's actually quite spontaneous, the different practices that you work with? There's not so much like a formula of, okay, we're gonna, do this ritual and then we're gonna do this sharing circle that you're constantly feeding into, what's required here, just being present with the energy in the room.
For sure. I mean, there's definitely some amount of pre-planning. I'm not going to pretend that I'm freestyling all the way through, but there's in between every exercise, there's an opportunity to, yeah, to exactly that, to feel into the kind of field that's created between people and hear a little bit about what's happening for the individuals in the room. And it may be that at this point, the last time we did this retreat, what was really in the field was fatherhood and people thinking about becoming fathers. But actually, this time when we go through it, what's really in the field is homophobia and people's experience of having to go through that as teenagers and as adults. And I try and respond to that and pivot to go, okay, let's honor what's in the room. Let's trust that there's a reason why this particular constellation of people have led this particular theme to emerge and feel like it's really alive. So yeah, it's a combination of planned and structured and tweaked each time to reflect what's been able to draw out the aliveness before, and also responding to what's alive right now that couldn't have been planned for.
Nice. So your bio on your own website says that you help people to return to their natural state of ease and flow, which is a sentence that I loved. So are you having the pleasure of seeing men that come through your programs get to this state of ease and flow, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I often say at the end of these groups, and I mean it every time, that it is such a profound privilege, for people to really open themselves up and go into some of their most challenging material and to challenge themselves to grow past that stuff. It's a real honor to be there and to witness it and
Mm.
to be able to create the types of spaces that invite that and encourage that. And yeah, people do have big shifts. People have contacted me afterwards to say that, their marriages have been saved because they learned to have the courage to be vulnerable. And I think that's one of the things that, vulnerability is used as a term a lot in these types of contexts. And it's often used without recognizing that what's required for vulnerability is courage, that there's both things there, that there's a certain strength in the courage to be vulnerable. So yeah, I have men contact me to say that yeah, their lives have been shifted in that way, that they've left their jobs and pursued the thing that was really meaningful to them, or they've made contact with family members who they'd lost contact with. And all of those things are wonderful. But I think the thing that's most gratifying for me is when people come and say, I just feel like I'm more at ease with myself. I just feel like I've landed
Mm.
more in myself and that it's a subtle shift, but it's a shift that's across everything I do. I just feel a bit more intimate with life. I'm not interacting with life behind
Mm.
a guarding armor. I'm not interacting with life at a kind of intellectually abstracted distance. I just feel more up against it with the highs and the lows of it. That's the thing that really touches me every time.
So you have a call coming up in just a few months' time that our audience will be able to find out about on Dandelion.
Hmm.
Well, thank you for that, Connor. And maybe let's turn to Sex Club now.
Hmm. Yeah.
So what's the genesis story of Sex Club? You told us a bit about why you decided to start working with men. Why did you start to feel that doing workshops on sexuality and intimacy would be important?
Yeah, well, I guess at this point it's good to bring my business partner Jules into the room as well. She definitely was the one who was touched by the inspiration to make it happen. She really rightly identify that there's lots of places out there for people to explore sexuality in various different ways, from the kink to tantra to everything in between. But there aren't so many places for people to actually speak and share honestly about what's going on in their sex lives, what's challenging, what's amazing, to kind of share insights and resources. And so often when people share about sex with their friends, it's either not with a lot of detail or maybe with a little bit of bravado or but rarely in the really open, honest, detailed minutia of what's going on. And we recognize that, just as the things that we hold shame about, we tend to keep hidden, the things that we keep hidden tend to develop a sense of shame around them. And sex is obviously a thing that's been shamed in our Western culture for a very long time. Thank you, Catholic Church, among others. And so we wanted to create a space very similar to the type of space that I was creating with for men, for people to come and to be really real about what's going on there, what's actually happening in your sex life, what's challenging, what's amazing, what's confusing, whatever. And yeah, again, it feels like one of those themes and topics that is an amazing leverage point into this crisis that's going on for people around meaning and direction and spiritual connection and all of those things, because sex touches on so much. When we first started developing the content for our retreats, we were, you know, thinking about, okay, what's related and what's connected to sex. And it started out with, okay, it's sex, right? There's that. And there's relationships is connected to that. And then, well, relationships are all about communication. So there's communication there, but sex is laden with so much shame. So we need to talk about shame as well. But then obviously, anytime we've got touch, we need to look at like boundaries and consent. And okay, that's a really important part of it. But then, well, maybe we're overcomplicating. It's also just about desire, right? Let's talk about desire and what's there. And it just kept growing all of the different things that it touches upon,
Mm.
which again brought us back to, wow, what an amazing topic to explore so much through.
Mm. And to explore with clothes on, as you make very clear in the event copy. So why is it important that Sex Club is a clothes on space? What does that allow for?
Yeah, well, what we wanted with Sex Club was we wanted to be able to simulate a lot of what happens in a sexual interaction or a romantic interaction, but to lower the stakes so that it was a little bit easier for people to notice what comes up for them and to have the time and space to reflect on it, to work on it, to move through it. Because in an actual sexual situation with clothes off, the stakes can often feel quite high and it can feel pressurized. And under conditions of high stakes and pressure, people often don't feel they have the time to check in with themselves, to maybe verbalize what they really want and what they really don't want, and all of those things. So, Sex Club being close on means that we can lower those stakes and we can give people a place to practice lots of the things that then they can take out into the world, take the clothes off, have sex with people, and apply them.
So I'm wondering if there are some common misconceptions or taboos that frequently come up in the workshops. Have you got like a top three things that people are afraid to speak about, or somehow an experience that is actually much more common than people realize?
The one that immediately jumps to mind is around libido. I think there's this common misconception that people, particularly men, for whatever reason in this kind of cultural story, want sex all the time. And it's just not the case. Men, women, everything, everything in between, non-binary folks, trans folk, no one, or no, I don't want to say no one, that's too absolute, but this idea that anyone would always want sex all of the time is pretty disconnected from what we've seen and experienced through running Sex Club. So that myth around libido is definitely up there.
How about taboo topics? Topics that clearly people feel some discomfort or fear to speak about.
Yeah, there's been some topics that we thought, initially maybe wouldn't be so juicy or have so much depth to them. And one of the ones that really stood out to me was around orgasm, that at first we were like, yeah, that's a really important thing for us to include and to talk about. And I don't think I appreciated just how much depth there was there, how much people haven't spoken about or maybe need to speak about their relationship with orgasm, their own, their partners, but just that has a lot of, I don't know if it's taboo, I guess it is, and some shame, but that's a theme that really people, every time we've brought that theme to any of our work, it really seems to really be appreciated and get a lot of activity.
So we've heard that it's all clothes on. Maybe you can give us a taste of what actual kind of exercises and practices people might expect in a sex club.
Yeah. So lots of different things, very similar to what I was describing earlier. So combination of verbal, non-verbal, movement-based practices, some touch-based exercises with other people, though we always make sure that those happen further into the event when people have had an opportunity to really find their feet and find their voice and really get into their bodies and feel comfortable in the space. We'll always do some work around boundaries and consent and all of that before we go into anything touched based. But it is an important aspect, and it does help us to really simulate some of what happens in a sexual interaction to have some touch-based exercises. So there's some of that as well. Yeah.
Nice. So a question I was looking forward to asking actually, which is whether these workshops have impacted your own attitudes towards sex and intimacy. What are you personally learning from this work?
I would say that piece around presence is probably the thing that I've incorporated most into my life and feels like one of the really key ingredients in intimacy and sexuality is the capacity to really present with what's going on for me, both inside of me and also where I'm touching the other person, but also really learning to be present with them and learning to listen, kind of full body listen to what's happening for the other person and attune to that and move in response to that. And then that kind of, what happens in our sexuality is so often it can be both a canary in the coal mine of what's happening in the relationship more widely, or it can amplify what's happening in the relationship more widely. And in the past, I've been in relationships where things were not going so well and we were working through it and we were kind of struggling through it, but some part of me was kind of hoping that, it would just figure itself out. But then in the bedroom, it would come out more obviously and unavoidably. And in lots of ways, that's a gift, right? That our bodies will be honest, even when our minds want to conceal, our bodies will be honest about what's going on. But yeah, it's been a real learning and gift to be in a space where people being really honest and open about their sexuality and all of the questions and inquiries and stuff, exercises that we do, Jules and I have done ourselves as well. So we've kind of gone through that deep inquiry into our own lives in terms of intimacy, relationships, sexuality. So yeah, it's been a learning curve, even as it's been a teaching curve at the same time.
Yeah, we've now spoken about these two programs that you've been running, the call and your other men's work and Sex Club. Just wondering, to what extent do you see connections between these two areas, and also to what extent you are having, well, it would be men kind of coming to one and then going to the other.
Mhm. Yeah, there's definitely lots of crossover, lots of men from the men's retreats coming to sex club and lots of the men from sex club coming to the men's retreats. Also, some of the women from sex club encouraging some of the men in their lives to come to the men's retreats. So yeah, no, it's really positive. It's really great to have that. And yeah, in terms of the overlap, I mean, sex does come up on the men's retreats, and issues around gender comes up in sex club, and we kind of cross-pollinate those two areas. And I guess what unifies them is that they're, you know, sex has so often been taboo and concealed and not spoken about. So it's an opportunity and a space to be really real about what's going on there. And likewise, men have been taught for a long time that they should conceal a lot of what's going on for them in their internal world. And the men's spaces are a space for them to be real about what that stuff is. So a lot of commonality in how these things go and the benefit.
Nice. Well, I think we're pretty close to wrapping up. Maybe I can ask you, what would you say to someone now who's heard about Sex Club or the men's work and is like, sounds pretty good, but like, can I do it? Is it for me? Maybe they're still slightly hesitant. Do you have some kind of invitation to make to these people?
Yeah, I guess I would invite them to, have a look, read the description, see what's there, and then feel into it, see if it's something that's calling to you. If there's some hesitation, some resistance, be curious about that. Maybe with that curiosity and inquiring into it, it feels like, actually, no, this isn't for me right now. I've got too much on my plate, or whatever it might be. Or maybe in checking in and inquiring into it, there's some resistance, but actually there's a deeper desire to grow and to challenge yourself to jump in. And if so, then please, we would love to have you. I would love to have you join any of the events. And you can always reach out to me as well if you're unsure where you're at with all of that, and we can talk it through.
Whether it's important and principled hesitation or whether it's a refusal of the call. Connor will be
Yeah.
able to help you distinguish those things and then maybe see you on a retreat at some point soon. Nice. Well, that's about it from me, Connor. I wonder if you've got any last words or any last things that you want to make our audience aware of.
No, I think just I want to thank you for, well, not just for creating this platform of the podcast, but also the Dandelion platform, and before that, the Psychedelic Society platform that's given me and so many people an opportunity to offer their work and brought such an amazing community together. So thank you for that. And thank you for listeners who've made it this far into the podcast. Thanks for sticking with us. And yeah, please reach out if you're curious to hear more about my work. I'd love to talk to you.
Nice. Thank you for today, Connor. It's just such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to feature such distinguished facilitators on the Dandelion platform and now on this podcast. So yeah, have a great day.
Thanks, Steve. You too.